Hi everyone, and thanks to the DLF Forum for having us. In this presentation, I'll talk about the challenge of securing sensitive archives with delayed release conditions and outline our proposal to address this increasingly salient problem. This is joint work with John Bowers, Jack Cushman, and Jonathan Zittrain, and you'll hear from John in the latter half of the presentation. So archivists face a wide range of challenges in maintaining archives, including data breaches, inadvertent loss, and legal coercion to sealed records. These threats are particularly salient in the case of sensitive materials that are donated with delayed release conditions, such as those only to be unsealed after the passing of certain individuals. Ensuring that donors can trust in archivists' ability to enforce such conditions is crucial to the preservation of our historical record. But power asymmetries and other threats often make it hard for archivists to actually be able to enforce these conditions reliably. So one particularly striking example of this was with the Belfast project. In 2001, journalist Ed Maloney launched this project, which was an oral history of the Troubles, a period of violence in Northern Ireland. Maloney and his team conducted interviews with organizers on both sides of the conflict under the condition that the recordings and transcripts would be stored in a library and would not be released until after the deaths of the folks that were interviewed. But more than a decade later, the Police Service of Northern Ireland used legal proceedings to gain access to the confidential archives, which they then used as a basis for 2 high-profile arrests. So the question here is not whether or not the PSNI had valid motives for wanting this information and for making the arrests, but rather the impact of this premature release and the undermining of the journalistic and archival agreements that had been made on future donors and the historical record. In general, we theorize that delayed release archiving faces 3 primary threat vectors. The first, which was nicely illustrated by the Belfast project, is legal coercion by courts, where the power asymmetry between courts and libraries can too easily lead to premature release of archives. Adversaries can also come in through the back door, through hacking or technical threats. And the final threat vector is inadvertent loss or destruction, perhaps through poor IT practices or drive failures. Archivists have spent decades developing best practices around each of these threat vectors already, but these safeguards are still not enough in the face of rapid technological progress, growing volume of digital artifacts, and increasingly aggressive efforts by governments and private parties to secure early release of materials. And so we really need to innovate in order to just stand still. We need to add additional layers of protection in order for archival institutions to even simply maintain the amount of control that they've had up to this point in securing sensitive archives. So related work in the digital archiving space is locks, which enables institutions to maintain digital information even after a web publisher ceases to offer the content. But locks and the dark archive version, clocks, are both less suited for the problem that we're considering, which is preservation of highly sensitive materials, which are likely to be targeted by authorities and hackers. What we propose is a protocol called Strong Dark Archives, SDA, which is an integration of technical and legal methods for secure delayed release archiving. The protocol relies on a trusted network of certified organizations willing to work together and is designed to supplement all the existing best practices for long-term digital stewardship. And if deployed properly, it stands to offer a new level of transparency and resilience, particularly with respect to this third threat of legal coercion. The main technical tool within SDA is something called threshold cryptography, which has existed in the cryptography literature for decades now. So usually we would encrypt materials using a secret key and then decrypt using the same key. But with threshold cryptography, once we encrypt the materials, we will split the key into, say, n equals 7 key shares, such that 5 out of the 7 shares are required to reconstruct the original key. And of course, whoever's performing this algorithm can choose t equals 5, n equals 7, or change up these numbers as desired. And now what this allows us to do is show that decrypting requires a consensus of at least 5 of the 7 parties to be able to access the sensitive materials. So now, keeping that technical tool in mind, I'm going to walk through the protocol at a high level. So once the donor gives materials to an archivist of his or her choice, the first step for the archivist is to choose a set of partner libraries within the SDA network and to initiate legal contracts to ensure that each library only divulges their key shares under the conditions specified by the donor. The second step is for the archivist to catalog, curate, and encrypt the sensitive materials using some sort of secure and open source software tool that we imagine will be pretty simple to design. The archivist should choose how and where the encrypted materials are stored, whether that is within a single library or splitting the ciphertext amongst the different partner libraries. Next, the tool will also allow the archivist to split the secret key and to send these key shares to the different partner libraries. Each of the partner libraries should protect its key shares as it would protect any other sensitive archive material. Finally, when the conditions outlined in the contracts are met, or when there's some pressing public need to release the materials earlier on, a majority of the partner libraries can come together to collectively unlock the original materials of the archive. So we can see by this distributed design, the protocol is resilient to both technical and legal coercion or failures. A good deployment of this protocol will also be resistant to future hacking techniques and easy to correctly re-implement from text instructions far into the future. And with that, I'll hand it off to John to discuss how to select and build this SDA network itself.
Thanks, Jayshree. My name is John Bowers, and I'll be handling the second half of this presentation, where we'll talk about the institutional dimensions of the Strong Dark Archives protocol. So, as you heard about previously, SDA depends on a network of partner libraries which hold key and ciphertext material. So together, they keep this material secure, and then when the conditions of a donation are met, they release the material according to the preset protocols, such that the original archive can be recovered and reconstituted. So given that SDA is not a pure technical protocol, but rather a blended technical and institutional one, the security advantages that it affords are only as good as the network of archival partners which the architecture of the scheme develops. So if we don't have good libraries and other archival institutions that are backing up the scheme, that are supporting it and implementing it, then fundamentally, we're not going to be able to make very good security guarantees. As such, an SDA implementation might benefit from a central hub managing the intake of materials from donors, library selection for any given donation, sort of setting that the partners who will receive key material for a given donation, as well as things like exceptional access requests from law enforcement and government. And having a coordinating entity like this might ensure that the processes that an SDA network needs to administer will go smoothly and will be consistent over time, that best practices will be properly developed and replicated. So in building an SDA network or a set of SDA networks, we don't need to start from scratch. Thankfully, there are actually a lot of resources already present arising out of the library and archival communities that we can draw on to bootstrap an arrangement along these lines. So first among these things is the existing networks of libraries and archival institutions that exist in the world today. So thankfully, librarians and archivists have been working together on complicated projects for a long time, and we could build on some of those existing arrangements in order to develop a foundation for an SDA network between trusted partners who have already proven to some extent that they're capable of handling sensitive materials and of working together. So that's sort of the first place that we'd look in developing one of these networks to be production ready. And then furthermore, there are existing certification programs for digital archival institutions, such as the Trusted Digital Repository certification and the Data Seal of Approval, that could help both in expanding SDA networks when new partners are sought and sort of added and embedded in that process, and also in setting standards for members of an SDA network, the level of care and the procedures that they should put in place. So let's talk a little bit about what strong dark archives might look like in practice by reference to the Belfast project issue that we talked about at the outset. So in the Belfast project, we effectively had a set of sensitive materials that made their way into a traditional dark archive, a library, and they were, according to this little dotted line here, scheduled for release to the historical record after certain conditions had been met. However, what ended up happening in practice is that through legal process, those archives were actually removed, and there were legally mandated releases of them in contravention of those donor conditions and expectations. All right, now let's look at how an SDA model might handle those sensitive materials differently and hopefully provide some additional clarity and security assurance to donors. So again, we can see we have our set of sensitive materials here, but this time, rather than going to a single archive, they're being fed into a hub organization. And this hub organization, in accordance with the SDA protocol, is selecting here, some number of archival partners. Here's 7 libraries, each of which is being provided with some amount of key and ciphertext material. And you can see from the lines here that in order to recover the original sensitive materials, this original archival material, 4 of them need to divulge their ciphertext and key shares. And so as you can see, we no longer have a single point of failure. The archive is effectively distributed such that in order for some entity, be it a government or law enforcement agency or other plaintiff, to access the materials contained in the original donation, they'd need to effectively procure materials from 4 of the partners rather than from a single entity. So that potentially gives you an additional degree of resilience and adds a little bit more friction to direct legal interventions against secure archival material. However, we're not creating a warrant-proof zone in this strong dark archive because this hub organization could conceivably set a clear and transparent set of standards for when and how it would provide exceptional access, or rather instruct partner institutions to provide exceptional access to materials that they contain to, say, law enforcement or government. And those conditions could be laid out quite clearly for donors and for the institutions involved at the outset, rather than sort of being, retroactively cobbled together on the back end in the course of litigation. And that hopefully will just lead to more transparent and predictable outcomes for donors, which in turn will boost their confidence in the archival process. And hopefully we don't need that at all. Everything goes well. And 4 or more of our archival partners can collaborate, divulge their key shares and ciphertext in the appointed way, and release the material to the historical record. So I'll just quickly summarize the presentation at this point. So first, in adhering to donor conditions associated with digital archives, archivists face a distinct and escalating set of security threats arising from cybersecurity vulnerabilities, legal pressure, and data loss. These problems aren't going to go away as more and more information is stored and archived digitally. Second, SDA is a blended technical and institutional protocol enabling better management of those threats through distributed cryptography, which minimizes single points of failure, provides a degree of robustness and redundancy, and ultimately, hopefully, boosts donor confidence. And finally, the last thing we'll stress is that getting the institutional dimension of this problem right will really be the hard part. Obviously, the technical details matter, but what matters more is ensuring that that network of archival partners functions as it's intended to. And our call to action would basically be, we'd love to engage with any of you to hear your ideas on how to crack that institutional side of the problem. And if anybody wants to get involved with potentially piloting something along these lines or trying a test case of the SDA protocol, we'd love to be in touch about that as well. Thank you so much for listening.